Why being shamed in the Middle Ages was worse than you think. Picture a market square just before noon. The church bell has rung, stalls are busy, and the air is thick with smells you can almost taste. Wet straw, wood smoke, pig fat, wool, leather, and people. A drummer beats a slow pattern. Children drift toward the sound like birds toward crumbs. Housewives pause with baskets on their hips. A reeve in a faded green cloak lifts a hand for quiet. The crowd parts, and you see the thing that has drawn them, a heavy wooden frame with slots for a neck and two wrists. The pillory waits like a hungry mouth. From the safety of the present, it is tempting to treat that frame as a quaint prop, an antique for photo ops. But to a medieval villager, it is not a joke. It is a stage, a warning, and a weapon. The pillory and the stocks do not simply immobilize, they expose. They fix a person at the height of the stair and turn a living human into a public object. What is taken is not only freedom of movement, but control of one's own image. Once locked in, you cannot bow your head, turn your shoulders, or soften your expression. The wood holds the body, the gaze wounds the self. This is what public shaming meant in the Middle Ages. It was more than spectacle. It was a sentence read aloud by the crowd and written into memory. Shame was not a fee one paid and forgot. It was a stain that spread into reputation, marriage prospects, business partnerships, guild standing, and everyday trust. In towns small enough to recognize one another's footsteps, disgrace did not end when the lock lifted. Consider the scene in the body. Weather and stiffness, the itch of dried mud. A fly tickling the corner of your eye you cannot brush away. A rotten apple slaps your cheek, and laughter rises. These are physical details, yet the target is the inner life. A bruise fades. Being laughed at by people you must greet tomorrow does not. That is why so many punishments insisted on visibility: shaving the head, cutting a ragged fringe for a disgraced clergyman, making a baker carry a too light loaf through the streets. The lesson is not do not steal, but do not be seen as a thief. In a world where honor bought trust, shame was a debt that compounded. Listen to the crowd. It believes it is keeping order. People act as audience and chorus jury in street press. Mockery is their headline, rumor their editorial. Authorities set the stage. The crowd amplifies the punishment. Even those who feel uneasy rarely intervene. It is dangerous to stand between a ritual and a crowd. Pause and try something. Imagine your posture held in place by wood. Imagine the sun inching across the sky more slowly than you thought possible. Now a question, the first of a few tonight. Would you rather take 10 quick lashes in private or one afternoon of this in public? Your answer will reveal how you value pain, memory, and the power of other people's eyes. The medieval imagination was steeped in the language of the soul. To be shamed was not only to be embarrassed, it was to be revealed. Shame exposed the inward stain to the outward world and reminded everyone of the boundary between order and disorder. Priests cultivated contrition, but civic authorities specialized in humiliation because humiliation worked. It was cheap, memorable, and contagious. One performance preserved 1,000 obediences. Another reason shaming bit so deeply the medieval person was only partly private. Identity was woven from affiliations, parish kin, craft, lordship reputation. Wound the surface of that cloth, and the whole garment frays. When a brewer was marched through town with a sour barrel tied around his neck, the joke did not end at his door. Next day's custom thinned. Marriage negotiations cooled. Shame rippled through gossip networks and outlived the original offense. The theater of shame had its props: iron masks that pinched cheeks and bit tongues, painted signs naming the offense in letters large enough for the back row, Rough music clanged from kettles and pans as processions snaked through night streets. These devices made a person legible to a crowd. The instrument said, "Look, this one is what the sign declares." Empowered by the message, onlookers shouted slurs and threw things that rarely injured. The point was not to kill, it was to display. What is the emotional architecture of medieval shame? Fear of the moment and of its echo, anger at officials, neighbors, and oneself, resentment that curdles into isolation, and a keener feeling complicity. To live in such a world is to participate in its rituals, even when you dislike them. The child who laughed grows into a man who averts his eyes. The woman who once looked away becomes a grandmother who shushes the young when they go too far. Everyone is threaded into the same cloth. Shame is effective because it recruits the audience as co-authors. Another gentle question for you in your own life: where does embarrassment linger longest in the body, in the mind, or in the story you tell about what happened? If you can name that place, you can sense what a villager feared when he glanced at the pillory and felt his neck prickle. Bodies heal, stories repeat. Here is how our journey will unfold. Next, we will examine the instruments of exposure: the pillory, the stocks, the shame mask, the humiliating donkey, ride the whipping post, and set them in their proper settings. We will listen for the crowd and learn its techniques: laughter, as lash rumor, as rope chant, as chain. We will trace the damage shame did to families and trades and meet those at the margins women tagged as scolds. Debtors made examples, outsiders who invited mockery and could not dismiss it. We will compare humiliation to bodily pain and ask why many feared disgrace more than death. We will also study the long tale of shame, the ways it persisted after the pillory fell out of favor. By the 18th and 19th centuries, authorities grew wary of unruly crowds. Yet communities still found ways to display sinners' names pinned to church doors, whispered lists in workshops, songs about a neighbor who shaved ounces off, sacks of flour. The instruments changed, the instincts remained. If you have watched a scandal swell online, you have seen a medieval habit wearing a modern mask. To keep our steps humane, remember that those who mocked were also vulnerable. The boy who jeered today might stumble tomorrow. The widow who hurled a spoiled turnip could be one rent payment from desperation. In a world without modern police, social safety nets, or reliable privacy communities maintained order as they could. Public shaming was a cheap communal method, a bargain many accepted. Why ask you to imagine yourself inside the scene to make empathy precise? When you visualize the pillory at noon, the glare, the ache between the shoulders, a child's giggle, you see why so many punishments targeted the face and posture rather than flesh and bone. The face is the billboard of the self. Control the face, and you control the story others tell about you. Settle in now. Pour something warm. Adjust your headphones. Let the noise of the present dim. We will cross English towns, German squares, and French bridges where life bustled even when a scold dangled above the water. We will read ordinances that dictated which offenses deserved, which displays, and listen for the human creak beneath the law's lines. We will meet people whose dignity splintered under the crowd's stare, and a few who kept a shard of themselves hidden from the worst of it. By the end of tonight's journey, you may see why those we meet feared shame more than pain. Pain ends. Shame remembers. The people who designed these punishments knew it. A town's memory is a ledger, and a name written there is not easily erased. The pillory was the pen the whole community held. One last invitation before we begin Part 1. If you are listening where you can comment, tell me without naming names about a moment when public embarrassment changed how you move through the world. Did it make you quieter, kinder, or more stubborn? There is no right answer. There is only the fact that shame even now can shape how we stand among others. Now, take a breath. The drumbeat in the square grows louder. The reeve signals. The crowd hushes. Step closer not to gawk, but to learn. Welcome to Why Being Shamed in the Middle Ages Was Worse Than You Think. The stage and its instruments, pillory stocks, masks, and public processions. Before we meet the crowd in full voice, we need to walk the stage and handle the props. Medieval shame did not happen in the abstract. It was engineered out of wood, iron, rope, signs, and timetables that synchronized humiliation with the busier hours of the day. The devices of public shaming did not merely restrain bodies. They choreographed a performance. They fixed a person into a posture, chose an audience, and announced a message so legible that even a child could read it without letters. Let's begin with the most recognizable frame, the pillory. At its simplest, it is a hinged board mounted on posts with semicircular cutouts for a neck and two wrists. The mechanism is crude and effective. Once the upper board swings down, the head cannot retreat and the shoulders cannot slump forward. The captive is elevated just enough that the face sits at eye level because the gaze is the point. Though many modern replicas stand alone like freestanding picture frames, medieval pillories were often set into the life of a town by the market cross near the Guildhall door at the bridge where traffic funneled. Officials could choose when to lock the pillory. Market days drew larger crowds. Fairs multiplied the effect tenfold. Humiliation is a low-cost punishment, but it yields the richest dividends at noon. Small engineering choices magnified the ordeal. Some frames had a slight forward tilt that let saliva and sweat run down the chest, adding mess to misery. Some positioned the feet on a narrow plank so the calves burned by the first hour. The boards pinched the soft place just below the skull. The shoulders ached. The hands tingled. The lower back fought for balance. When we say the pillory exposed a person, we should hear both meanings: the moral unveiling and the rough literal vulnerability to weather, insects, thrown food, and the occasional stone that slipped past the beetle's half-hearted warnings. What the pillory did best was to erase the ordinary options people used to manage their appearance. You could not fold your arms, turn your profile, or wipe your cheek. You were available completely for other people's choices. The stocks performed a related function at ground level. Here the holes gripped ankles and sometimes wrists, while the offender sat or knelt on a low bench. The posture seemed less dramatic, but its message was sharp, reduced, immobilized, safely mockable. Children could come close. Dogs could sniff. A passerby might plant a heel a foot away and deliver a lecture with the confidence of a schoolmaster. The stocks democratized contempt. You did not need height to meet the offender's eyes. A butcher with blood on his apron could tut about honesty. A brewer could guffaw about sour beer. A woman with a sleeping baby on her shoulder could shake her head and mutter shame. Each of these micro-encounters stitched the punishment into daily life. Even if the stocks stood off the main road, the news of who sat there would travel like wood smoke. Both instruments were frequently paired with signage, sometimes literal placards naming the offense, and sometimes symbolic. A baker who cheated the weights might have a light loaf hung from his neck. A false accuser could be fitted with a wooden tongue. A dishonest miller might display a measure with a hole drilled through the bottom. These props turned the body into a billboard and made the lesson visible from 20 paces. It mattered less whether a spectator heard the town crier's words than whether they recognized the image. A sign simplified a person into a single trait: thief, scold, cheat, fornicator. And yet, while the sign claimed certainty, the community read it with all the messy complications of memory and gossip. Some nodded along. Others rolled their eyes and whispered that the sheriff's cousin kept 2 measures behind his own counter. Masks belonged to the same grammar. Iron shame masks, or scold's bridles in some places, covered the face with exaggerated features, long noses for liars, animal ears for fools. Some bit the tongue with a small plate or spike so the wearer could not speak without pain. Beyond the practical silence enforced by the gag was the deeper silence of being turned into a caricature. The wearer's own face, the most intimate instrument of human meaning, was replaced by a sign that spoke for them. The mask told the crowd how to read the person, and doing so invited a particular kind of laughter. It said, "This is a joke you are permitted to enjoy." If we shiver at these masks, it is because they make explicit what the pillory and stock's already implied shame seeks to fix identity, to freeze a complex life into a single picture. Public processions extended the stage across the whole town. Instead of pinning the person to a spot, officials used movement to gather witnesses. A drum or bell led the way. Beadles walked on either side. A constable punctuated the route with declarations. The condemned might be made to carry the instrument of their misdeed: a too light loaf, a broken measure, a stolen tool. Adulterers could be paraded side by side. Cheats were made to retrace the steps of their fraud. In some places, rough music pans, kettles, horns shook windows and pulled people to doorways. Spectators did not need to understand the law's subtleties. They only needed to see the procession and attach a story to the face at its center. A punishment concentrated in time could be multiplied in space. Street after street, the lesson repeated itself. Sometimes the procession rode rather than walked. One notorious variant seated the shamed backward on a donkey and sent them through town facing the tail. The posture inverted dignity. Facing backward denied the ability to meet people's eyes. One could not choose whom to acknowledge. It made the rider look ridiculous, and ridiculous was the point. Laughter is a form of consent. It signals that what is happening is acceptable. That is why authorities tolerated and sometimes arranged small comic touches: a hat with bells, a placard hung crooked, a tail smeared with soot. These details gave the crowd a role and provided a release valve that kept the scene from tipping into violence. The donkey's slow, stubborn pace also made it easy to keep up. Children could walk alongside. Old men at doorways could time a jeer to match the hooves. Not all instruments were so spectacular. Whipping posts, for example, often carried a more sober weight. A set number of lashes delivered in public did double duty. It satisfied the law's demand for bodily correction while advertising the community's resolve. Whipping could be paired with time in the stocks or followed by a brief parade. The choreography varied, but the message held steady. The flesh is harmed, but the face is the point. People winced at the crack of a whip, but they remembered the posture of the one who bore it, whether he grinned falsely, stood blank, or pleaded with tears. The theater taught not just that wrongdoing is punished, but also how a punished person ought to behave. A shame ritual had scripts within the script. A small case will make the machinery concrete. Imagine a brewer named Martin who has sold weak ale at a festival. The guild has fielded complaints. The reeve has investigated. The barrel proves sour. The sentence: 2 hours in the pillory on the next market day, followed by a procession around the square with a small cask slung from his neck. The bailiff chooses noon for the pillory and arranges for the town crier to read out the offense every quarter hour. A boy runs ahead to the far end of the market with the news. By the time the church bell marks the half hour, the front row is 4 deep. Martin's wife does not come. His apprentices linger at the back and pretend to laugh. A rival brewer plants himself by the cheesemonger and performs a face concerned, then disappointed, then resigned, as if he were helpless before the failings of others. While Martin stands locked in place, people approach with the everyday props of their trade: a butcher's knife, clean, a baker's peel, flour to tailor's, measuring tape taut between both hands. Each item becomes, for a moment, a visual argument about honesty. My knife is sharp. My weights are true. My measure is straight. Why could you not keep your ale sound? No one says these exact lines, but the tableau says them wordlessly. When the crier reads the offense, the crowd confirms with murmurs and small jokes. A child reaches up and touches the grain of the wood as if the pillory were a friendly horse. An old woman squints and says to no one in particular that her son died of a fever when the brewer's father was still alive, and that life is hard. The remark has nothing to do with ale, but everything to do with how shame feels when it settles into the seams of a town's memory. After 2 hours, Martin's neck throbs. His shoulders seize into cramps. The lock lifts with a clack that sounds to him like a door closing. The procession begins. The small cask thumps his chest in an awkward rhythm. Someone strikes up rough music on a pan. Another bangs a spoon on a bucket. Children follow as if it were a holiday. The rival brewer peels off toward his own stall, having harvested all the sympathy he requires. By the time Martin returns home, the damage is not only what the law intended. The next day, certain customers will carry their coins 2 doors farther down the street. The week after, his apprentice will ask whether the rival has room for another pair of hands. When we claim these instruments were effective, this is what we mean. They were machines for converting a single offense into 100 private decisions. At this point, it is worth pausing for breath and for a brief question. If you lived in such a town, do you think you would walk over to the pillory out of curiosity, or would you keep your head down and hurry past? There is no moral prize for either answer. The point is to locate yourself inside the scene, because all these devices relied on ordinary people behaving as ordinary people do, curious, cautious, eager not to miss the day's story. The devices also manipulated time. Officials could choose durations with psychological bite just long enough to force stillness into pain, just short enough to avoid heat stroke or frostbite. A sentence of 1 hour at noon feels different from 2 hours from dawn. The first collides with the market's busiest moment. The second isolates. The season mattered too. An autumn wind could turn a simple posture into trembling. A summer noon could melt patience into rage. In some places, the calendar synced humiliation with feast days, making a moral example part of sacred time. The more we look, the less accidental the theater appears. Of course, instruments were only as fair or unfair as the authorities who wielded them. A merchant with friends at court might find his public punishment scheduled on a rainy morning when the market was thin. A quarrelsome neighbor with a long memory might whisper to beetles to look away at the right moment so a few stones could fly. Devices do not produce justice by themselves. They produce effects. What the Middle Ages perfected was not equity, but efficacy. They found forms that etched lessons into the mind like acid cuts metal. If we step back and compare the instruments, a pattern emerges. The pillory and stocks immobilize and expose. Masks and signs define identity. Processions distribute the message. Whipping punctuates with pain. All of them stage the face as the central screen. Their brilliance, if we may use a cold word for a cruel art, is to transform abstract wrongdoing into social geometry. They fix a body at a crossing of lines between buyer and seller, neighbor and neighbor, official and subject, and they invite those lines to pull tight until the person inside feels like a knot. One last, softer prompt before we move on in your own world, which matters more to you. The opinion of a few close neighbors or the anonymous crowd passing by medieval punishments were built to weaponize both. The close neighbors provided the long memory. The anonymous crowd provided the short, loud echo. The instruments you have just handled were designed to harvest each in turn. In the next part, we will leave the wooden frames and iron gags to their posts and turn to the people who animated them, the crowd, how it gathered, how it learned what to do, and how laughter, chant, and rumor became the whip that left no mark, yet stung the longest. The crowd laughter chants and the mechanics of humiliation. If the pillory, the stocks, the masks, and the donkey ride were the stage, then the crowd was the actor, the critic, and the echo all at once. Without an audience, the devices would have been awkward furniture. With an audience, they became rituals that etched themselves into memory. To understand why being shamed in the Middle Ages was worse than you think, we must pause not only before the wooden boards, but also among the people who gathered around them. The medieval crowd was not passive. It did not merely watch, it animated the punishment. When a reeve or beetle fastened the pillory, the punishment technically began, but the real ordeal only started when neighbors arrived. Voices gave the first blows. A jeer pierced as sharply as a pebble. Laughter fell heavier than rotten fruit. In a society where reputation was currency, mockery was devaluation in real time. Crowds formed naturally. Market days guaranteed numbers. Feast days swelled them further. Bells, criers, or simple word of mouth carried the news. People came from curiosity, habit duty, or the hope of diversion. Children skipped toward the sound of rough music. Apprentices found excuses to linger. Housewives extended errands. For many shame, spectacles were woven into the fabric of daily routine. They were not extraordinary events. They were the theater of ordinary justice. Once assembled, the crowd organized itself, almost without instruction. The front rows pressed close, claiming the best view. Behind them, merchants conducted side bargains while keeping half an eye on the stage. A few self-appointed commentators narrated the scene, supplying wit for those less quick of tongue. From balconies and upper windows, others leaned to throw their own contributions. Participation was graded by distance, but everyone was inside the circle of complicity. Why did people relish these spectacles? Part of the answer lies in the psychology of relief. To see another person shamed was to confirm one's own relative safety. The merchant who delivered short waits yesterday but escaped detection could laugh extra loudly today. The wife who feared her sharp tongue would be noticed could shout at the scold in the chair without risk. By directing attention outward, each participant temporarily cleansed themselves. Shame was contagious, but so was its opposite relief that the victim was not you. Another element was entertainment. Records make clear that punishments drew laughter. Chroniclers describe roaring crowds, children dancing, ballads improvised on the spot. The event was not pitched as fun, but people found fun in it anyway. Human beings are wired to treat spectacle as diversion, especially when sanctioned. It was safer to laugh at a pilloried man than to laugh at your lord. In a society with limited leisure and few theaters, the street became a stage, and punishment doubled as performance. Here is a question for you. If you had lived, then do you think you would have laughed? Or would you have stood silent, feeling pity, but unwilling to show it? Imagining your own reaction is not meant to judge, but to reveal how strong the current of the crowd must have been. To resist that current required courage most did not dare display. Crowds also improvised. Authorities might prescribe the sentence, but the people added color. They hurled mud-dung spoiled vegetables. They composed rhymes or nicknames. They mimed the condemned's offense. An adulterer might hear bawdy songs. A liar might be greeted with exaggerated nods and smirks. These improvisations made each punishment unique, more memorable than the official script. A sentence of 2 hours in the stocks meant little until the crowd chose whether those hours would be endured in silence, ridicule, or escalation. Sometimes escalation tipped into violence. Chroniclers record occasions when fruit gave way to stones, when a pilloried man was blinded, when a woman fainted from jeers and never recovered. Officials usually tolerated a degree of roughness, but they walked a line. Too much blood undermined the idea that shame corrected rather than destroyed. Yet it was the very volatility of crowds that made shame effective. Nobody could predict how far things would go. The condemned feared not only the device, but the people around it. The presence of children amplified the punishment's sting. To be mocked by peers was one thing. To be mocked by the young who would carry the memory into their adulthood was another. A child's giggle could echo in a town's memory longer than an adult's curse. This is why so many punishments were timed for midday when children were most visible. Officials knew the echo mattered more than the moment. Women, too, played distinct roles. Some jeered loudly, especially against female offenders, labeled as scolds or adulteresses. Others stood at the edge, muttering sympathy. The complex texture of these reactions reminds us that the crowd was not monolithic. Within it were strands of pity, cruelty, indifference, curiosity. Together they created a chorus whose sound was unmistakable judgment made flesh. Crowds could also invert the script. There are cases where sympathy overwhelmed mockery. A poor debtor pilloried in winter might receive cloaks or bread from neighbors. A woman accused of petty theft might be pitied by mothers who saw hunger in her children's faces. In such cases, the punishment backfired, shaming officials instead. Authorities dreaded this reversal because it revealed the fragility of their theater. If the crowd refused to laugh, the performance collapsed. The mechanics of crowd participation extended beyond the moment. Gossip carried the shame into homes and workshops. A jeer shouted in the square was repeated at the hearth. Children who saw their neighbor mocked would incorporate the insult into playground games. The community rehearsed the punishment long after it ended. In this way, the crowd multiplied the duration. A sentence of 2 hours could last a lifetime. Let us imagine a scene. A tanner named Robert is accused of selling hides with false measurements. His punishment: 1 hour in the stocks during market day. The town crier announces it, and within minutes a circle forms. Apprentices nudge each other and mimic stretching leather. Housewives murmur about the smell. Boys chant a rhyme about short hides, long lies. Someone throws a scrap of spoiled meat. Robert tries to speak, but laughter swallows his words. By evening, the rhyme has spread through 3 taverns. Days later, children repeat it in play. Months later, a rival weaver uses it as a jibe during bargaining. Years later, a neighbor recalls it when Robert's son seeks apprenticeship. The crowd has extended 1 hour into decades. The crowd's power rested on its numbers, but also on its memory. Written records were scarce. Oral memory carried weight. What 100 people saw and repeated became truth. In this sense, shame was a democratic weapon, not because it was fair, but because it relied on collective participation. The community became both jury and archive. This collective nature also meant that shame blurred boundaries between official justice and popular feeling. Authorities could sentence, but they could not dictate tone. The people supplied laughter, venom, or pity. They could escalate or diffuse. They could make a punishment sear like fire or fade like smoke. The devices fixed the body, but the crowd inscribed the meaning. Pause with me here. Imagine standing in that circle not as the condemned, but as a neighbor. Would you speak? Would you throw something? Would you whisper sympathy? Or would you simply watch blending into the background? Each choice carried risk. To jeer loudly was to mark yourself as loyal to authority. To pity too openly was to risk suspicion. To remain silent was safer, but silence itself could be read. The crowd was not only an audience, it was a mirror in which everyone measured themselves. The crowd's role explains why medieval punishments lasted centuries. Devices could have been discarded as crude, but the people kept returning because the rituals served social needs. They reinforced boundaries, relieved tension, and provided stories to tell. In villages with few diversions, shame spectacles were both moral lessons and social drama, and yet the same energy that made them effective also made them unstable. A jeer could turn into a riot. Pity could turn into defiance. This volatility is why many rulers eventually abandoned public shaming. By the 18th century, officials realized that crowds were unreliable partners. But in the Middle Ages, their energy was the lifeblood of humiliation. As we close this part, remember shame was not the device alone. It was the murmur, the laughter, the chant, the gossip. The instruments fixed the body, but the crowd carried the punishment into the bloodstream of the community. Without them, the pillory was wood. The stocks, planks, the mask iron. With them, each became a stage for human judgment. In the next part, we will explore the deeper wounds left by this chorus, how shame did not stop at the individual, but seeped into family honor, staining children and grandchildren long after the laughter faded. Rituals of public humiliation. In the medieval world, punishment was designed to be seen. Justice worked best, contemporaries believed, when it was audible in the clanging of bells and visible in the stillness of a bound body. The crowd was not an accident of timing, but a necessary instrument. To be punished meant to be displayed, and to be displayed meant to be judged by neighbors, rivals, and strangers. Spectacle gave the law its force, and memory gave spectacle its afterlife. Picture a market morning. Stalls bloom with bread and cloth apprentices, shout prices, and a thin cord of smoke climbs from a brazier. At the square's edge stands a wooden frame of hinges and holes. When the constable arrives with an offender, every errand pauses. The boards swing open the head and hands slide into place, and a new performance begins. From that moment, the culprit is no longer only a butcher who shaved weight or a brewer who watered ale. He has become a public figure in a drama everyone knows how to play. The pillory was the purest version of this stage. The device itself was simple carpentry, but its power lay in how it recruited the town. Passers-by were invited to speak with gestures. Some tossed spoiled vegetables, others shouted rhymes, a few stood in tight-lipped silence that signaled a colder judgment. Nicknames were coined on the spot. A man could exit the frame with bruises and still carry the wound of a new name for the rest of his life. The law provided the frame. The audience provided the sting. Stocks worked with a similar logic and were often placed where foot traffic was thickest. Immobilized feet and hands turned the human figure into a lesson. Parents steered children past and explained in firm tones why honesty mattered. Laughter trained the young as effectively as lectures. In this way, the square became a classroom and the stocks its blackboard. The punishment ended when the lock opened, but the lesson continued every time a child repeated the rhyme he had learned that day. Some rituals added movement. The cucking stool or ducking chair strapped the condemned into a wooden seat and plunged her into a river or pond while onlookers laughed. The cold water shocked the body, yet the sharper blow fell afterward in the form of a nickname. Duck could follow a woman for decades, whispered at market and embroidered into jokes. Punishment mixed water with words, and the words lasted longest. Public processions expanded the map of disgrace. A butcher who sold rotten meat might be led through familiar streets carrying spoiled cuts. A brewer who weakened ale might walk with a small barrel tied around his neck. Each corner became a stage, each doorstep a row of seats. The walk ensured that no resident could claim not to have seen. Neighbors who would never confront someone to his face could join the chorus by calling out from windows, turning private disapproval into public theater. The soundscape mattered. Bells rang to summon spectators. Town criers announced names and crimes in a voice trained to fill streets and courtyards. Drums or horns punctuated the beginning and end of sentences. The volume was not incidental. Noise spread a message faster than parchment and anchored the event in memory. A silent punishment might be endured and forgotten. A noisy one was rehearsed by the community each time someone repeated its details at supper. Religion wove its own thread through these scenes. Church penance often required a sinner to stand barefoot at the door with a candle in hand or to kneel publicly before the altar in a rough robe. The intent was forgiveness, yet the consequence was social exposure. Parishioners saw who stood and when. They remembered as people do, and years later they could still associate a family with that moment of abasement. Mercy and mockery met within the same ritual, and the border between them was thin. Architecture reinforced the lesson. Pillories and whipping posts were fixtures, not props wheeled in for the day. Their presence reminded everyone of the possibility of disgrace. Street names kept the memory alive. Pillory Lane, Stocks Alley, Ducks Brook. Geography became a catalog of cautionary tales. To walk home from church was to pass the place where a neighbor had once stood and to feel again the echo of his shame. Rituals also varied by region and craft. In parts of Germany, the Schandmantel, literally a coat of shame, forced offenders into heavy painted garments that advertised their offenses. Italian towns favored donkey parades, a comic reversal that signaled social inversion. In France, bakers who cheated on weight might be decorated with strings of loaves and ordered to hand bread out under watchful eyes. The props changed, but the idea was constant. Fit the symbol to the offense so that even a child understood. Gender shaped the stage. Women were most often punished for offenses of speech, scolding gossip, public quarrels, because a loud female voice was treated as a civic disorder. Men, by contrast, were more often exposed for economic or physical wrongdoing. Devices and scripts reflected these expectations. The ducking stool targeted the body that had spoken too much. The placard naming short weight targeted the man whose scales had lied. Rituals taught what the culture praised and what it feared from each sex. Crowds gave the ritual its energy and its danger. There were days when onlookers kept to jeers and spoiled fruit, and there were days when stones flew. Chroniclers record deaths in the pillory and drownings during duckings. Officials tried to moderate the crowd, but could not fully control it. A fine had a number. Lashes could be counted. The crowd's temperature had no dial. The very unpredictability of public shame made it terrifying. Nobody could predict whether an hour would be endured or barely survived. Festive culture borrowed and amplified these scripts. During carnival towns staged mock trials and charivaris, noisy processions with pots, pans, and masks. These were not official punishments, yet they refreshed the memory of official ones. A husband mocked as henpecked a widow remarried too soon, a miser who refused to give alms. Each could find himself at the center of an unsanctioned parade. The result was the same. The neighborhood learned its lines, and order was enforced with laughter. Children absorbed the forms early. They learned the posture of the pillory by imitating it in games. They repeated playground rhymes about stock spawn and jug priests. By the time they reached adulthood, they did not need a clerk to explain how a punishment worked. They had rehearsed it in play. Thus, shame reproduced itself without instruction manuals. The next generation arrived already fluent in the gestures of ridicule. Guilds added an economic dimension to ritual. A dishonest craftsman might be paraded by his fellow members not only to punish him, but to protect the trade's collective name. Faulty wares could be hung at a shop door as a public display of failure. Tools might be branded. These rituals made the abstract idea of reputation concrete. Customers were meant to leave convinced that standards were defended. The individual paid in exposure so that the guild could be paid in trust. Not all rituals struck downward. Occasionally, great people were humiliated as well. A noble who offended the church might be ordered to process barefoot or to kneel in view of the congregation while a priest named his fault. The message to spectators was sharp status did not erase sin. Of course, elites often negotiated milder scenes or more private stages. The lessons still held. Even if the pain was light, the sight of abasement was heavy with meaning. Let us pause for a question that edges into our present. If you had to choose between 10 strokes of a rod in private or 2 hours in the stocks at noon in the square, which would you choose? Medieval people often chose pain because the social wound of exposure was longer and harder to heal. Their choice tells us how the ritual felt from inside the frame. Why did these ceremonies work so effectively? Because they enlisted every sense and every layer of community life. Sight fixed the offender's image. Sound carried the story. Space turned everyday paths into routes of remembrance. Symbols translated crime into costume. Participation transformed onlookers into judges. In such a world, a person's reputation was a fragile vessel. A single morning could crack it, and no fine could glue it back together completely. Ritual humiliation also taught boundaries. It declared which behaviors the community would not tolerate and who had the authority to enforce that boundary. The constable held the key, but the crowd held the verdict. A quiet group could soften a sentence. An angry group could intensify it. In this sense, public shame was not only a tool of rulers, it was a tool of neighbors. Everyone who showed up helped write the script. Finally, consider the walk home. The board's open, the strap loosens, the guard nods. The punished person steps away. His skin will mend. What follows him is not the sting of fruit or the ache of joints, but the murmur that starts behind him and moves ahead of him. A rhyme catches among boys. A window closes. A merchant hesitates before granting credit. The ritual is over, yet its echo continues from mouth to ear to memory until it no longer needs the device that started it. These were the rituals that made medieval punishment a theater of instruction and a factory of stories. They were accurate in their way about the social nature of wrongdoing, but they were also cruel because the story they created clung longer than any bruise. To understand them is to see how a community taught itself by performing itself, and how a single morning spectacle could become a lifetime's name. The mockery of symbols and costumes punishment in the Middle Ages did not rely only on boards and whips. It also relied on signs, costumes, and props that turned the offender into a living caricature. These devices transformed individuals into walking lessons, visible symbols of their own failings. Shame was stitched, painted, and strapped onto the body, forcing a person to carry disgrace not just for an hour, but sometimes for weeks. Placards and signs were among the simplest tools. Hung around the neck, they announced crimes in bold letters or crude drawings. A thief might wear the word stealer. A slanderer might carry a tablet showing a wagging tongue. The visual message spared no one. Even those who could not read recognized the picture. Such signs made speech redundant. The body itself became a billboard of dishonor. Costumes carried the symbolism further. In parts of Germany, the Schandmantel or coat of shame was a heavy garment painted with bright colors and decorated with symbols of the crime. A man accused of drunkenness might wear a tunic covered in painted wine cups. A dishonest miller might be wrapped in a cloak painted with mice gnawing at stolen grain. These garments were intentionally uncomfortable, weighted with wood or metal so that movement itself became labor. To be clothed in such a costume was to walk under a visible burden as well as a physical one. Other cultures developed their own variations. In France, fraudulent bakers were paraded with loaves tied to their necks or carried baskets too heavy to bear. In Italy, debtors sometimes wore donkey ears, their tall shape turning the head into a comic scene. In England, scolds were gagged with iron masks shaped like beasts called branks or scolds' bridles. The iron mouthpieces pressed against the tongue, silencing it while drawing stares. Each device was carefully chosen to match offense and symbol. These costumes did not exist in silence. Crowds shouted rhymes to match the props. A woman in a brank was followed by chants about wagging tongues. A man in a drunkard's cloak, a barrel with holes cut for arms, was met with songs about empty cups and stumbling feet. Humor deepened the humiliation. The crowd turned a punishment into theater, ensuring that memory of the event lasted longer than the bruises. Animals sometimes played a role in these spectacles. Offenders were mounted backward on donkeys holding tails like reins. The inversion mocked not only the rider but also the natural order. Man was meant to command beast, yet here beast commanded man. In some regions, pigs were paraded beside gluttons, goats beside lustful men, hens beside quarrelsome women. The pairing declared guilt as loudly as any judge could. The church used symbols too. Penitents wore sackcloth, walked barefoot, and sometimes carried candles taller than themselves. These props signaled contrition, but also advertised fault. A noble who might otherwise escape recognition was unmistakable in penitential costume. The visual message overpowered any attempt to pass unnoticed. Even mercy came clothed in mockery. The durability of these props lay in their afterlife. Garments were sometimes hung in churches after penance, reminding congregations of sins long past. Masks were stored in town halls, visible warnings of civic discipline. Children grew up seeing them and hearing stories of their use. A symbol did not vanish when removed. It lingered in memory, in rumor, and in sight. Satire and literature mirrored these punishments. Fabliaux and popular plays often dressed characters in comic costumes to exaggerate folly. Audiences laughed at cuckolds with horns or fools with donkey ears. These stage devices echoed real punishments, and real punishments fed back into theater. The line between performance and penalty blurred, making life itself a stage on which symbols were props. In some cases, offenders were forced to provide their own costumes. A corrupt official might fund the creation of a mask that mocked him. This doubled the sting to be shamed and to pay for the instrument of that shame. Records tell of guilds that required dishonest members to sew their own badges of dishonor before expulsion. The offender stitched thread by thread the fabric of his disgrace. Regional differences shape the imagination of shame. In Spain, records describe sinners who wore pointed hats marked with flames or devils, precursors to costumes later used by inquisitors. In the Low Countries, carts carried offenders dressed in patched rags painted with jokes about their misdeeds. In Scandinavia, horned helmets were sometimes placed on adulterers, mocking both their virility and their foolishness. Each town, each culture improvised with the materials of theater to craft its own language of ridicule. Gender also determined design. Women accused of gossip were often punished with gagging devices highlighting their tongues. Men accused of laziness might be forced to wear heavy collars or to drag weights, highlighting their failure at strength. Symbols did not just mark guilt, they reinforced social expectations. They taught men and women alike how society believed they ought to behave. Sometimes these punishments blended comedy with cruelty. Chroniclers describe one man paraded in a cloak covered with feathers and labeled a cock for his boasting. The laughter was genuine, but so was the lasting injury to his reputation. Another account tells of a woman forced to balance a loaf on her head for hours, mocked as queen of bread thieves. The absurdity of the scene made it memorable, and memory was precisely the point. Not all crowds enjoyed the sight. Pity occasionally pierced through mockery. A child crying at the sight of a parent in costume, an elder stumbling under a barrel, too heavy a woman fainting beneath a brank. These moments created unease. Officials sometimes intervened, shortening the ordeal. Yet the image was already stamped in collective memory, its power undiminished. Symbols also lingered in language. To call someone a donkey rider or a brank was to invoke punishment imagery. Nicknames hardened into labels, and labels could cling to families. Inheritance of ridicule was one of the heaviest legacies. A costume might last a day, but a name born from it could endure for generations. We should pause here and reflect. Imagine being forced to wear your mistake on your own body, to have your fault announced in fabric and iron. Which would you choose, a fine in secret or a costume on public display? Medieval authorities preferred the costume, for it taught longer and wider lessons than a hidden payment. By weaving signs, costumes, animals, and props into ritual, medieval communities made sure that crime had a body. Wrongdoing was not invisible. It was dressed, displayed, and ridiculed. Justice was not only written in law books, but worn in the streets. That was the lesson. Disgrace should be seen as well as felt. As we close this part, recall the image of a man stumbling in a barrel, a woman gagged in iron, a baker bent under the weight of bread. They carried not only wood and metal, but also the gaze of every neighbor. And when the costume was gone, the story remained stitched into memory. In medieval justice, props were never mere objects. They were instruments of storytelling, and storytelling was the harshest punishment of all. Class, gender, and the unequal burdens of shame. Not all shame was distributed equally. Just as wealth and privilege shaped medieval life in every other domain, so too did they shape who was shamed, how, and with what consequences. To say that everyone could be punished is true in theory, but misleading in practice. The poor, the powerless, and especially women bore the heaviest weight of humiliation. To explore this is to uncover how shame was not only a tool of justice, but also a tool of hierarchy. Start with class. Medieval courts proclaimed that law bound rich and poor alike, but the staging of punishment reveals a different reality. A wealthy merchant caught cheating might pay a fine to avoid the pillory, while a poor peddler guilty of the same offense found himself locked in the stocks. Nobles could negotiate private penance. Peasants endured public humiliation. Officials justified the disparity as pragmatic. Let the merchant pay, for the town needs his trade. Let the peddler stand, for the town needs its example. One offense, two outcomes. The ledger balanced on paper, but not in the square. The poor were ideal subjects for spectacle. They had little power to resist and few allies to intercede. A peasant who stole firewood might be paraded through town, while a lord steward guilty of embezzlement might quietly lose his post. Shame became another way of telling the poor where they belonged at the bottom, visible and vulnerable. The crowd's gaze, which could be merely uncomfortable for a man with resources, became life-threatening for someone whose livelihood depended on fragile trust. Urban and rural settings shaped these patterns differently. In market towns where reputation was a trading asset, public shame could devastate a craftsman's business for years. In villages where everyone knew one another's kin, disgrace could poison the well of neighborly reciprocity. No more borrowed tools, no shared oxen, no second chances. In both settings, poverty magnified exposure. A rich man could leave for a season, make deals elsewhere, or hire advocates to launder his name. A poor man had no elsewhere to go. Gender deepened the divide. Women were disproportionately targeted for offenses framed as moral or social disruptions, gossip, scolding, sexual impropriety, disorderly behavior. Devices like the cucking and stool were designed almost exclusively for them, a woman strapped to a chair and dunked in water while the crowd hooted. The spectacle was pointedly theatrical. It punished not only a deed, but a voice. In a culture that prized female silence and obedience, humiliating noise and wet clothing performed the lesson: be quiet, be small, be contained. Men, of course, were punished too, but often for economic crimes like fraud or theft, which carried a different social meaning. Male shame targeted dishonesty in trade. Female shame targeted perceived disorder in the household and the street. The message was clear: men threatened property, women threatened propriety. Both deserved correction, authorities claimed, but the correction was gendered in design and effect. Clothing and hair amplified the message. A man punished for theft might wear a placard naming his crime. A woman accused of sexual misconduct could be forced to parade with hair unbound or shorn. Loose hair signaled moral looseness. A shaved head signaled ruin. In some towns, garlands of nettles or straw were placed on women's heads to mark them as hot or empty. The symbolism was unmistakable. The female body itself, its hair, its gait, its clothes, became the stage of shame. Where a man's disgrace attacked his dealings, a woman's disgrace attacked her person. Consider how sumptuary and modesty norms fed into humiliation. Authorities who policed fabrics and colors also policed bodies and voices. A woman who dressed too richly for her station could be jeered as presumptuous. A servant girl who laughed loudly in public might be labeled a scold. The same action that looked like confidence in a noble woman looked like insolence in a peasant. Shame, in this sense, served as a translator that turned social prejudice into moral verdict. Let us pause for reflection. If you lived in such a society, which would frighten you more, punishment that fined your purse or punishment that mocked your body and voice? For many medieval women, the latter was the reality. Their reputations were fragile, tethered to ideals of chastity and quietness. A few minutes of spectacle could undo years of careful conduct, and the echo of a nickname could outlast a dowry. The intersection of class and gender could be devastating. A poor woman accused of scolding might be ducked, ridiculed, and then avoided by potential suitors. A noble woman, by contrast, might be sheltered by family influence. Her transgression could be reframed as melancholy female weakness or illness and treated behind closed doors. The theater of shame rarely entered castles. Its stage was the market square. Its actors were drawn from the commons. Ethnicity and outsider status added further layers. Jewish communities endured humiliations not as punishment for individual crimes, but as collective stigma, distinctive badges, segregated seats at public events, ritual mockeries at festivals. These were not corrections aimed at reform, but signals of permanent exclusion. Similarly, strangers, travelers, beggars, itinerant laborers were easy targets. Without local reputations to protect them, they could be whipped out of town for vagrancy, while residents who skirted the same rules were merely warned. Shame here functioned as a border, it told people, where belonging ended. Guild life illustrates class privilege with painful clarity. When a master craftsman cheated on measures, his guild might impose a fine and a discreet apology. When an apprentice did the same, he could be paraded with a broken tool around his neck and dismissed from service. The lesson was not subtle. Shame flows downhill. A guild that valued its collective reputation found it expedient to sacrifice the lowly and shield the profitable. The hymn of honor sounded loudest when sung over someone else's humiliation. We can follow a single day to watch these dynamics at work. It is market day in a bustling town. Two offenders are punished within the hour. First, a prosperous cloth merchant whose bolts weighed light. He pays a heavy fine and stands briefly at the church door, head bowed, while the priest announces his contrition. Over by the river, a washerwoman accused of scolding her neighbor is strapped to the cucking stool. She is ducked 3 times amid laughter. The crowd disperses. By afternoon, the merchant shakes hands with suppliers and returns to business. The washerwoman walks home, soaked, shivering, and renamed. Her nickname will appear in rhymes before week's end. 1 hour, 2 endings. The difference is not the offense, but the body and the purse that bore it. Another scene in London. Sex workers found breaking curfew are carted through the streets wearing striped hoods. The cart raises them above the crowd, guaranteeing visibility. Their clients, some of them wealthy, settle fines and slip away unnamed. The spectacle converts the women's poverty into theater, while converting the men's privilege into silence. Shame speaks loudly for one side and whispers for the other. Hair again carries meaning. In parts of Germany, women accused of adultery might be marched with shaved heads. Beauty, an asset in the marriage market, was stripped away, branding them as undesirable. Men accused of the same offense sometimes faced fines, sometimes short penance, sometimes nothing at all. Even when punished, men were rarely disfigured. To spoil a man's face risked spoiling his work. To spoil a woman's hair signaled moral cleansing and social warning. The instruments of shame were calibrated to different bodies. Outsiders within the town, midwives, widows who ran alehouses, foreign servants, could be shamed for disorder. Their livelihoods existed at the margins of male guild control. A midwife accused of gossip could find clients wary. A widow who sold ale late could be pilloried for noise. These punishments reminded everyone who owned the right to speak to gather to sell. Regulation disguised as morality flowed through humiliation's channel, carving boundaries around female labor and migrant work. Resistance, though rare, deserves notice. Some women shouted back during duckings. Some men in stocks sang obscene ballads that turned the crowd's laughter against itself. A few communities intervened when inequality felt unbearable, bringing cloaks to shivering prisoners, slipping bread to hungry children, speaking aloud that enough is enough. On these days, shame faltered. Officials disliked such moments, for they revealed that the crowd's consent, not the device, was the true engine of humiliation. Another question for you. When you see rules fall more harshly on some than on others, does it make you distrust the rules or the people who enforce them? Medieval people often distrusted individuals while continuing to trust the system. They blamed beetles for cruelty but praised the stocks for justice. They scorned a gossiping neighbor yet revered the ritual itself. That habit of criticizing actors but preserving the stage helped inequality endure. The law itself sometimes encoded double standards. Some towns allowed offenders of good name to compound pay to commute public shame into private penance. Others permitted authorities to choose the time and place of disgrace, so well-connected wrongdoers found themselves punished at dawn and drizzle, while the poor stood at noon and Sunday. Even measurements of punishment where bent 1 hour could stretch with delays for crowds and speeches, while a short penance for a guildmaster ended as soon as a proclamation was read. Bodies marked by labor suffered more from exposure. A day away from the loom or field could mean missed wages, Wet clothing could lead to illness. A public nickname could thin a customer line by half. Privilege mitigated these costs. A merchant's fine stung but did not starve. A peasant woman's ducking cost a week's income and her good name. Shame, then, was not only unequal in form, it was unequal in price. We should also note how children felt the weight of classed and gendered shame. A boy whose mother had been ducked might be taunted as duck's chick. A girl whose father stood in the pillory might be called stock spawn. Such nicknames fused poverty and misbehavior into identity. They made inequality hereditary. This is how a few hours in the square could harden into a family fate. Did anyone attempt reform? Occasionally. Pain versus disgrace. Why shame cut deeper than the whip? When we think of punishment, the imagination often reaches first for the body blows, lashes, bruises, and scars. Yet in the Middle Ages, many feared shame more than pain. They dreaded the pillory more than the whip, the ducking stool more than the rod. Why? Because pain is bounded by nerves and hours, while disgrace is bounded only by memory, and the crowd's memory is long. Physical punishments were common. Whipping posts stood in squares. Birch rods lay ready in manorial courts. Branding irons marked thieves and vagrants. The spectacle of blood was familiar. A thief flogged 20 times might limp for days, but if he returned to his stall, sold honestly, and was greeted without mockery, the episode could recede. Pain, in other words, had limits set by the flesh and by time. Humiliation had none. To be locked in the pillory, jeered at, and pelted with filth was to suffer in the eyes of others. That suffering did not end with the unlocking of the board. It lingered in stories retold at hearths, in nicknames, sewn to a person like a second garment in the little paws a neighbor made before lending a tool. The body healed. The village remembered. This is why offenders sometimes begged for lashes instead of the pillory. A few minutes of agony was preferable to a life lived under a laugh. Visibility explains part of it. Pain can be private. Shame is public. A man whipped in a backyard could hide welts beneath a tunic. A person pilloried could never erase the sight of their face trapped and helpless at noon. Everyone saw. Everyone could recall. The punishment lived on in other people's eyes. The audience's role explains more. Pain inflicted by an officer is a transaction blow. Given blow received. Humiliation recruits the whole community. Neighbors become participants, throwers of refuse, authors of rhymes, judges dispensing tiny verdicts with a curl of the lip. The crowd stretches the sentence beyond what the clerk wrote. You do not simply serve your time. You inherit a chorus. Let us pause here. Imagine you had a choice, 10 lashes delivered swiftly in private or 2 hours in the stocks at market noon. Which would you choose? The question is not theoretical. Medieval offenders often faced a similar trade. Their choices reveal what mattered most: bodily comfort or social survival. Another difference lies in memory. Pain blurs. Shame is sharp. Ask yourself which moments you recall more vividly, the broken toe or the time you were publicly humiliated. The toe aches and then is forgotten. The humiliation replays in color. Medieval villagers knew this. Chroniclers preserve sayings that sound like hard wisdom. Better the rod than the stocks. The whip leaves stripes, but shame leaves marks on the soul. Whether or not the phrasing is exact, the sentiment is unmistakable. Religion deepened the edge. Priests taught that Christ suffered both pain and humiliation, and that the latter was the true test, the spitting the robe, the crown of thorns, the road of mockery. To share humiliation was to share the passion. Thus, shame acquired a spiritual gravity that pain alone did not carry. A flogging corrected the flesh. A public penance proclaimed the sinner's smallness before God and neighbor. Many would rather sting under a rod than shrink under a stare. Gender shaded the experience. Men tied honor to reputation for truth and steadiness in trade. Ridicule threatened that standing. A scar might be worn like proof of toughness, but a nickname was ruin. Women's honor was bound to chastity and obedience. Public ducking for scolding could shadow them for decades. The water was cold and quickly recovered from. The laughter was hot and did not cool. For both sexes, humiliation gnawed at identity, not merely at skin. Economics turned the screw tighter. Pain did not necessarily ruin a living. Shame often did. A farmer flogged might still harvest. A baker mocked as a cheat could lose half his customers by week's end. A cooper who endured the stocks could keep making barrels, but those barrels might sit unsold. The whip touched nerves. Shame touched bread. Judges recognized the difference and paired the two. Sentences often combined lashes with exposure whipping, followed by the pillory ducking, followed by a parade with signs. The first satisfied the demand for bodily correction. The second satisfied the demand for social deterrence. Pain is private justice. Shame is public pedagogy. Yet when contemporaries ranked punishments by dread exposure sat higher than the lash. Consider two scenes. In the first, a petty thief chooses 20 lashes over the pillory. He grits his teeth, counts the blows, and stumbles home. For a week, he sleeps on his side and pulls his tunic carefully. After harvest, his back bears faint scars, but at the market, nobody points. He is the man who was flogged, not the man who stood. In the second scene, a woman taken up for scolding is ducked on a cold morning. The shock steals her breath. By evening, she warms by the hearth. But the boys on the lane giggle duck's chick every time she passes. 5 winters later, the nickname still nips her heels. The body is an honest ledger. It records pain, then heals. The town is a second ledger. It records humiliation, then rereads it. That second ledger is the crueler book. Time is the hidden instrument that makes shame worse. Pain ends at the count 5, blows 10-20. Humiliation starts at the count and then keeps going in memory. It appears in hiring decisions in marriage talk, in who gets asked to stand godparent, in who is greeted first at the alehouse. A sentence of 2 hours in the stocks can last 2 decades. Physical punishments were also paradoxically controllable. A bruise has a predictable course. A flogging, if not excessive, has a foreseeable recovery. Exposure is unpredictable because crowds are unpredictable. Will they throw apple cores or stones? Will they sing a crude verse that becomes a town favorite? Will a rival seize the moment to perform his own virtue at your expense? The unknown turns humiliation into a gamble many feared to play. There is a small, grim mercy in the whip. You can look at your wounds and say this much and no more. No such boundary exists for disgrace. You cannot dictate when the story ends. Someone may revive it next feast day, or when a similar case appears, or when the Reeves nephew wants a joke. Laughter has no statute of limitations. Bodies sometimes fail under pain. Whippings killed. Brandings infected. Bones broke. We should not romanticize physical punishment as trivial. But even in brutal cases, communities told themselves that bodily penalties were just. Humiliation was different. It could make a culprit weep aloud and still be judged not enough because the point was not pain, but posture the facial theater of defeat. Offenders who stared levelly at the crowd could be read as defiant. Those who begged might be jeered for theatrics. Shame had unwritten scripts. The guilty were expected to follow, and failing to follow them invited more scorn. Let us test this with another question. Which memory changes you more, the time you were hurt or the time you were laughed at? which altered how you walked into a room, which taught you to avoid the square at noon. Medieval people adjusted their routes, their friendships, their ambitions around potential disgrace. Fear of pain taught caution. Fear of shame taught invisibility. Humiliation also weaponized silence. Pain makes noise. People cry out, and then the sound ends. Shame buries itself in quiet choices: who does not look up, who does not speak, who avoids the fair, who moves to a parish where no one knows the story. The whip produces a shout, the stocks produce a hush that lasts. The psychology is easy to sketch without pretending to modern science. Pain is present tense. Disgrace is narrative. You can blink through pain. You cannot blink through a story people like telling. A scar is a mark. A nickname is a leash. Public penance blurred the categories. In church, a penitent in coarse linen stood with a candle while the priest named the sin. There was little bodily suffering. Yet the humiliation penetrated deep because it was staged before the community of salvation. Even if neighbors forgave the penitent, remained the one who stood for years. That memory whispered in pews. People turned their heads a fraction when he passed the peace. Lashes do not follow you into liturgy. Shame does. We should also note how families felt the difference. A father beaten for poaching might frighten his children for a day. A father pilloried for cheating could cost his daughter a marriage for a decade. Pain is individual. Shame is contagious. That contagion described in earlier parts is what made humiliation feared. It threatened not only the body, but the household ledger of honor. Guilds codified the preference for exposure. Where a fine could hide a merchant's misdeeds, a stint in the pillory announced them. Honest members wanted the latter because it preserved collective trust. That utilitarian logic ruined one to reassure many made shame dominant in urban justice. It also made it cruel. A ruined man could not redeem himself easily, even if he later lived uprightly. The guild's trust recovered faster than his name. Pain could be worked off. Disgrace often could not. A debtor might labor to repay silver. No labor repaid a laugh. A servant could save coin to buy freedom from a master. No coin bought freedom from a nickname. The one debt had terms. The other had only interest. There were voices that tried to tilt the balance. Some priests preached mercy, urging towns to shorten exposure in winter, to forbid stones, to end duckings for the pregnant or elderly. Some magistrates scheduled punishments at off-peak hours when they quietly pitied the offender. These mitigations tell us something: people recognized that shame could slide into cruelty more easily than the whip. Lashes had a clerk's number beside them. Disgrace had none. Real stories. When shame became flesh and memory general, descriptions can make medieval humiliation feel distant, like a set of devices listed in a museum label. Real stories pull us closer. Court rolls, civic accounts, sermons, and village tales reveal people whose names and trades were fastened to ridicule, sometimes for a lifetime. In their experiences, we can see the full arc of shame, from the first jeer in the square to the last whisper years later. Begin with Alice of Cheapside, a brewer in 14th century London. Accused of selling watered ale, she was set in the pillory with a cracked jug tied to her neck. The market swelled around her as the bells called noon. Boys scrambled for a better view and flung yesterday's loaves. Women scolded her for cheating households of honest drink. When the beadle unlocked the board, the punishment ended in time, but not in memory. For months, buyers avoided her stall, even after she brewed a stronger batch. People greeted her with a smirk and a rhyme about thin ale. The town took back its trust slowly, and some never did. A Parisian clerk offers another angle. He forged a seal to free a cousin from a debt. Caught and condemned, he was paraded with sheets of bogus parchment tied around his neck, then locked before Notre Dame. The laughter focused on the costume, not on the lash that might have replaced it. The papers fluttered in the wind like a flock of white birds, while children called him collar of paper. He left the city soon after. Years later, a notary wrote that a talented scribe had vanished because his name would not hold ink. Punishment remade him as a joke, and his trade could not bear the joke. In Cologne, a butcher who sold tainted meat was set astride a wooden horse, holding 2 spoiled sausages like reins. Children followed, delighted by the absurdity. Adults laughed too, and a song bloomed by afternoon. The tune outlived the day, and so did the lesson. Customers crossed to other stalls for months. The guild claimed that public faith had been restored. The butcher counted the cost in empty hooks and long hours without buyers. A York case shows how quickly a woman's reputation could be rewritten. Margaret, accused of scolding, was strapped to the cucking stool and ducked 3 times in the river. The splash drew cheers. That evening, a group of boys began calling her Duck, and the name followed her to the end of her life. She married, had children, and managed a household, yet the first word shouted at her in the lane was still that nickname. A brief plunge in cold water became a decades-long immersion in gossip. German towns recorded punishments that turned craft into costume. A miller named Klaus, accused of skimming grain, wore the shandmantle painted with vermin. He tried to stand proudly, but squeaking noises trailed him for months wherever he walked. He repaired an old millstone for free, gave alms to the poor, and offered to grind widows' grain without fee. Generosity softened some hearts, but not all. The animals painted on the cloak had crawled into the imagination of neighbors and nested there. Priests sometimes stood in the same glare as lay people. A French parish once made a drunken cleric walk barefoot through town with a large earthen jug in his arms while the choir boys sang a penitential psalm. The jar was heavy and awkward. He stumbled on the rough stones and blushed as people murmured. For years after, villagers joked about jug bearers whenever a priest passed too near a tavern. The office regained its dignity, but the man's personal gravity remained slightly tilted. Children did not escape the theater. A boy in a German market was caught stealing apples and ordered to carry a basket on his head while apples rolled to the ground. Other children ran after him, snatching fruit and singing a chant. The chronicler who recorded the scene admitted that the boy never returned to the market as an adult. The theft was small and the physical pain light, yet the humiliation rerouted an entire life. The crowd's rehearsal of the story made it hard to outgrow. Some punishments were staged to reach everyone at once. In Siena, a wine seller who cheated on measures was made to carry a leaking cask through the streets. Red liquid ran down the staves and onto his clothes as people laughed. The image was theatrical and precise. The town did not need a proclamation to understand the meaning. The next day, honest sellers wore clean aprons and poured generous cups. Shame had done the work of a dozen inspectors. In Bruges, a thief was chained to the city gate with a hungry dog tied beside him. The dog barked all afternoon, pulling on the short rope and making the man flinch. Children imitated the barking in the weeks that followed whenever they spotted him in a lane. The dog was gone, but the sound remained. People later forgot the man's original crime and remembered only the dog. Memory chose its own details and clung to them. There were political versions of the same script. After a failed protest in an Italian city, several ringleaders were paraded in cages through the piazza. The authorities wanted a warning rather than a martyr. One of the men met the crowd's eyes and smiled with forced calm that made onlookers uneasy. The smile became a story almost as strong as the cage. Some said it showed defiance. Others said it proved he had been broken. In either telling, the city learned that laughter could close a chapter without opening a shrine. Rituals of exclusion marked entire communities. In 13th century, England Jews were forced to wear badges and sometimes targeted by festival parodies that pushed them to the edges of town life. The humiliation was not tied to a single offense. It attached to identity. The badge transformed ordinary errands into public scenes. Even kindness acquired the flavor of spectacle because the mark turned every encounter into a performance of difference. One story from the Low Countries shows how ridicule could be redirected. A widow who sold ale was accused of short measures. The guild planned a parade with a barrel around her shoulders. She arrived wearing a clean apron, a bright ribbon at her sleeve, and an expression that was neither angry nor meek. During the walk, she announced that every passerby who brought a cup could take a free draught that evening. Laughter shifted into cheers. She still carried the stain of the sentence, but she also carried herself with care. Years later, people remembered that she had made the parade feel like a festival of generosity. Resilience could not erase shame, yet it could change its flavor. Despair shadowed other cases. Records speak of men who fled after pillory sentences, leaving families to handle debts and gossip. A woman ducked for adultery drowned herself the next day. Chroniclers rarely paused to mourn, but the very presence of such notes hints at a cost officials could not count in ordinances. There were limits to the lessons society tried to teach. Sometimes the lesson shattered the student. Folklore kept stories alive long after the people vanished. Villagers told of a miser who refused alms and was paraded with a heavy chest chained to his neck. After he died, some swore they heard the chain rattle along the church path at night. Whether anyone truly heard, it matters less than the function of the tale. Ghost stories are social memory with a lantern. They carry a rule across generations without a clerk to copy it. Another kind of memory lives in language. Many surnames began as jokes or rebukes: Short Loaf, Swiftfoot, Drinkwater, and countless others. A public moment hardened into family identity. Descendants carried pride or irritation as they liked, but the label followed the line. It is hard to imagine a lash that lasts that long. Words can. Several vignettes expose how punishment wrapped the body in metaphor. A sailor who joined a mutiny in Venice was tied to the mast and rowed around the harbor while bystanders shouted. He was not whipped that day. He was made into a warning buoy. Another man, a debtor in an Italian hill town, had paper coins glued to his cloak. When he tried to brush them off, people laughed and pressed more against the fabric. He learned that debt is not only a ledger but a costume. Community rituals revived disgrace long after the sentence. During Carnival, actors performed mock trials of famous local sinners. A miller who cheated a generation earlier returned as a character with a padded belly and a sly grin. Children who knew only the name joined the laughter as if they had been present at the real event. Shame persisted because it could be restaged. The stage solved the problem of time. Not every performance struck downward. A noble who insulted a bishop was ordered to walk to the cathedral barefoot, carrying a candle large enough to tire his arms. The bishop met him with formal forgiveness. Onlookers whispered about the contrast between velvet cloaks and bare feet. The noble's pride survived the day, but people smiled knowingly for years when they passed him in the street. They had seen him reduced to the same human scale as the rest of the town. Consider, too, how these stories reveal the mechanics of fear. Pain threatened the body. Humiliation threatened the narrative that held a life together. A craftsman could accept a beating and return to his bench with a story of endurance. He struggled to return with a story that overcame a song everyone loved to sing. Laughter alters the script by which a community recognizes a person. Cultural memory, proverbs, songs, and folklore of shame. Public punishment ended in an hour or a day, but its echoes lingered in language, song, and story. Medieval culture ensured that shame lived on by weaving it into proverbs, rhymes, and tales that circulated far beyond the square. In this way, disgrace outlasted the punished and became part of collective memory. Proverbs carried lessons sharpened by humiliation. Sayings such as, "better the rod than the stocks," or "the duck leaves water but not her name," distilled community wisdom. Even if we cannot always trace exact medieval wording, chroniclers and later collectors confirm that everyday speech absorbed the memory of punishments. Proverbs turned individuals' pain into permanent cultural markers, teaching children through rhyme what courts had taught through spectacle. A proverb's power lay in repetition long after the punished were gone. Their disgrace survived in words. Other proverbs focused on gossip and scolding. English collections preserve lines such as, "A woman's tongue is her rod," or "The ducking is short, but the shame is long." These sayings condensed entire punishments into portable warnings. Anyone who repeated them carried forward the lesson, embedding humiliation in daily conversation. Songs extended memory further. Market rhymes often mocked offenders long after the event. Ballads named scolds, cheats, or adulterers, freezing their stories in verse. Some of these songs survive in fragments. "She that sold the watered ale divided by sat the pillory pale and frail." Whether sung in jest or cruelty, these verses kept alive the details of shame. A man flogged could heal. A man mocked in song became a chorus. The audience of punishment thus multiplied over time, as even those not present could recall the disgrace through melody. Folklore magnified the effect. Tales of dishonest millers, lusty monks, or gossiping wives often drew on real punishments. The characters bore traits of actual neighbors, but were given new names, allowing the story to circulate safely while the association remained obvious. In villages where everyone knew the backstory, listeners could wink at one another. Folk tales thus disguised memory while preserving it, ensuring that shame passed into legend without losing its sting. Storytelling repeated at firesides and fairs ensured disgrace lived as long as the tale. Consider how children absorbed these lessons. Nursery rhymes often echoed public punishments. A rhyme about a girl ducked in the brook taught obedience alongside humor. Boys sang chants about the Stocksy spawn or the Juggy priest. These verses became playground tools of exclusion, reminding young listeners that humiliation was part of the moral order. Childhood games rehearsed adult ridicule, preparing the next generation to enforce shame. In this way, shame was hereditary, not just in family honor, but in culture itself. Let us pause here. Think of the songs or sayings you learned as a child. How many of them carried warnings disguised as humor? Now imagine that those songs named people in your own town. Medieval children grew up chanting the disgrace of neighbors, normalizing cruelty as tradition. Written literature also preserved shame. Fabliaux comic tales from medieval France often ridiculed adulterers, greedy priests, or quarrelsome wives. These stories drew laughs, but also reinforced social norms. Satire immortalized what the pillory had displayed. In this way, literature joined law and religion as a third theater of humiliation. Characters like the foolish carpenter in Chaucer's Miller's Tale echo real punishments of cuckolds, keeping laughter alive centuries later. Audiences learned morality through ridicule as much as through sermon. Art and marginalia reinforced memory visually. Manuscripts sometimes depicted fools or sinners in poses that mimicked the stocks. Church carvings showed women with wagging tongues or men with asses' ears, pictorial reminders of disgrace. Even if an individual escaped mention, the type was memorialized. One could see in stone or ink a warning, "This is how shame looks." The permanence of art carried the impermanence of ridicule into future eyes. Gargoyles, leering from cathedrals, or grotesques drawn in manuscripts, extended laughter across centuries. Another interaction for you: which would you fear more? Your name forgotten, or your name remembered only as a joke? Medieval people often faced the latter, their identities preserved solely as lessons in shame. Collective rituals kept humiliation alive. During festivals, communities staged mock trials or charivari noisy parades, targeting those accused of misbehavior. Pots and pans clanged outside houses of remarried widows or mismatched couples. These performances blurred punishment and festivity. Even when not ordered by courts, neighbors revived shame through theater. A man once pilloried could find his disgrace reenacted annually in carnival jest. Memory was not passive. It was active, renewed, performed. Charivari demonstrate how communities recycled humiliation. They were not about correction, but about memory. A widow who remarried quickly might face banging pots, not because she broke a law, but because the community recalled others mocked before her. Tradition turned ridicule into inheritance. Thus, shame was not only an event, but a renewable resource. In many towns, these mock rituals became more feared than official penalties, precisely because they struck without warning and lasted as long as neighbors remembered. Chroniclers note how rulers sometimes harnessed these rituals for propaganda. A rebel paraded backward on a donkey became a story retold in taverns, sermons, and chronicles. His disgrace was not allowed to fade. Kings and lords understood that humiliation was cheap and lasting, more powerful than executions that ended lives without leaving jokes. To laugh at a rebel was to prove his weakness. To keep laughing was to ensure he never rose again in memory. Disgrace in this sense was a political weapon as well as a social one. Even natural landmarks absorbed these tales. Scold's Brook or Pillory Lane fixed punishment in geography. Generations later, people might forget the offender's name but still use the placey name, repeating shame unconsciously. The land itself bore witness. Modern maps still preserve traces of these labels, silent echoes of medieval ridicule. Geography remembered what parchment and lips forgot, embedding humiliation into the very environment. We also find legal codes reflecting this memory. Some towns recorded nicknames, officially attaching them to fines or property rolls. A man once called Short a Loaf might find the name written beside his dues. Bureaucracy fossilized mockery. Even if neighbors forgave, parchment did not. The weight of ink prolonged laughter into administration, binding shame into tax rolls and property disputes. Archives turned the jeers of the crowd into permanent records. Folklore scholars note the persistence of stock characters: the drunkard, the scold, the dishonest trader. These figures circulated across Europe, recognizable in England, France, Germany, and Italy. Though details differed, the moral was constant: shame awaits those who defy communal norms. Cultural transmission made humiliation portable. A tale heard in one village might resurface in another, attached to new names, but the same lesson. Memory moved with merchants, minstrels, and monks, spreading disgrace like seed corn. Sometimes memory twisted into cautionary myth. In one English tale, a woman who mocked her husband was said to have been cursed to quack like a duck forever. The story likely originated from ducking punishments, but morphed into supernatural warning. Children who heard it did not need to know the legal background. The tale itself carried the moral. Shame thus blurred into folklore, half history, half fable. Similarly, German tales spoke of millers whose dishonest scales attracted demons, reflecting how communal suspicion became narrative curse. Communities also told ghost stories of the shamed, Spirits of suicides after punishment were said to haunt bridges or rivers. These tales transformed private tragedy into public lesson: resist disgrace or it will follow you beyond death. Such legends reinforce the terror of humiliation, magnifying its reach into eternity. To be mocked in life was bad. To be mocked in legend was unbearable. Haunted lanes and cursed rivers preserved disgrace as folklore long after courts had closed. Across all these forms, proverbs, songs, ballads, folk tales, carvings, rituals, we see the same principle: shame was durable because it was repeatable. Pain ends, memory repeats. Lashes scarred one body, songs scarred many ears. By embedding punishment into culture, medieval society ensured that humiliation never truly ended. The crowd dispersed, but the proverb remained. The stocks were dismantled, but the rhyme endured. In some ways, culture was the harshest executioner of all. As we close this part, reflect on how memory works in your own world. Which mistakes of others become stories retold at gatherings? Which jokes outlive their cause? Medieval people lived in that echo chamber, constantly surrounded by reminders that disgrace was the most lasting punishment of all. In the next part, we will consider how shame shaped not only the lives of the punished, but also the power of those who wielded it. Judges, priests, neighbors, and rulers who learned to govern through laughter and fear. Power through humiliation: how rulers, priests, and neighbors governed with shame. To grasp the true weight of public humiliation in the Middle Ages, we must recognize it not merely as a punishment, but as a tool of governance. Shame was currency, wielded by rulers, priests, guildmasters, and even ordinary neighbors. It was cheaper than prisons, more visible than fines, and more lasting than whips. Through disgrace, authority was maintained not only from the top down, but also horizontally within communities themselves. Kings and lords knew the value of humiliation. To parade a rebellious noble backward on a donkey, or to shave his head and strip his heraldic cloak, was to make rebellion laughable. Laughter disarmed treason more effectively than execution, which could turn traitors into martyrs. By turning opponents into objects of ridicule, rulers ensured obedience without bloodshed. Chronicles record how kings deliberately staged these rituals. One French monarch forced a captured rebel to crawl before him in a city square watched by thousands. The humiliation broke his prestige more thoroughly than chains would have. Sometimes rulers staged punishments not only for traitors, but also for themselves when compelled by the church. Henry IV's barefoot pilgrimage to Canossa in 1077 is one of the most famous examples. Standing in the snow barefoot and in penitent garb, the emperor endured 3 days of humiliation before Pope Gregory VII. His abasement symbolized the power of spiritual shame over temporal might. Even though Henry regained strength later, the memory of Canossa endured as a parable kings themselves could be unmade through ritual humiliation. Priests likewise wielded shame as a spiritual weapon. Penance was often public: sinners confessed aloud, walked barefoot through town, or wore sackcloth marked with ashes. Excommunication, the church's severest penalty, was itself a ritual of disgrace. To be cast out visibly from the congregation was to suffer not just loss of sacraments, but loss of honor. Priests amplified humiliation in sermons, naming names from the pulpit so that communities knew who had sinned. This public exposure ensured that spiritual correction doubled as social punishment. One striking account tells of a priest who forced an adulterer to stand at the church door with a rope around his neck every Sunday for a year. Parishioners had to step around him on their way inside. His body became an object lesson in sin. In another case, a penitent noble was ordered to crawl on hands and knees to the altar while villagers looked on. For the church, the deeper the humiliation, the greater the redemption. Yet for the individual, the loss of dignity was permanent. Guilds and towns also thrived on shame. Reputation was the lifeblood of commerce, and guild courts protected it fiercely. To be declared false before one's peers was devastating. Punishments often included hanging defective goods on shop doors, parading dishonest craftsmen, or branding tools. These actions were less about physical pain and more about declaring unworthiness. The guild's honor was restored by publicly lowering the offender's status. In a world where trust meant survival, shame was a more efficient regulator than imprisonment could ever be. Consider the example of a dishonest baker. If he were fined quietly, customers might never know. If he were whipped in private, the community might forgive quickly. But if he were pilloried with loaves tied around his neck, mocked as short a loaf, and forced to give away bread, his humiliation became common knowledge. Every customer remembered, every rival repeated the story. The guild's reputation was saved, and the offender carried the burden indefinitely. Even neighbors used humiliation to police behavior. Charivari gossip and mocking songs enforced conformity without legal intervention. A husband seen as henpecked might find himself serenaded with pots and pans outside his home. A miser might wake to find caricatures chalked on his door. These rituals were informal yet powerful signaling that the community itself had judged. Such ridicule could drive people to change habits, leave town, or in some cases, despair. Let us pause for reflection. Imagine you lived in a small medieval town. Which would you fear more, the bailiff's whip or the neighbor's laughter? Authority lay not only in official courts but in the ceaseless vigilance of peers. The durability of shame as governance lay in its cost and effectiveness. Prisons were expensive, executions risky, but ridicule required little more than a stage and an audience. Moreover, shame reproduced itself. A single punishment became a proverb, a nickname, a tale, multiplying its reach at no additional cost. Authorities recognized this efficiency and leaned on it heavily. Religion added a cosmic layer. To be shamed was not only to lose face before men, but to risk damnation before God. Priests equated public penance with salvation, framing disgrace as purification. Parishioners absorbed this teaching, seeing humiliation as both punishment and redemption. Thus, rulers and clerics aligned worldly order with divine justice, doubling the weight of shame. The interplay of top-down and bottom-up shame created a web of control. Lords staged humiliations of rebels. Priests staged humiliations of sinners. Guilds staged humiliations of dishonest craftsmen. Neighbors staged humiliations of nonconformists. Together, these forces ensured that every person lived under constant surveillance, not just of eyes, but of laughter. Consider the architecture of town. Market squares with pillories, churches with pulpits, guild halls with benches, all were stages for shame. The built environment was designed to make punishment visible. One could not pass through daily life without being reminded of disgrace. Power was embedded not just in people but in spaces. The very streets carried echoes of ridicule. Another interaction for you. If your community today had the power to publicly ridicule mistakes in the town square, do you think people would behave differently, or would ridicule merely breed cruelty? Medieval authorities believed firmly in the former. Rulers also understood the symbolic depth of humiliation. When a defeated enemy was forced to kiss the ground or hand over his sword hilt, first the act was theatrical as well as political. These gestures taught spectators more than words could. The authority of kings rested not only on armies but on their ability to script humiliation that reinforced hierarchy. Rituals of surrender became rituals of disgrace. Priests extended this logic through rituals like the barefoot pilgrimage. A noble who offended the church might be ordered to walk miles without shoes watched by villagers. His suffering was less about the soles of his feet than about the sight of his abasement. Religious spectacle magnified the lesson. No one, not even the great, escaped the theater of shame. Guilds combined ridicule with economics. A tailor caught using poor cloth might be forced to wear his own defective garment in public. A smith who cheated on weights could be paraded with an oversized hammer strapped to his back. These punishments turned tools of trade into instruments of humiliation, ensuring that every passerby understood both crime and consequence. Communities, too, weaponized memory. Once someone was mocked, the story circulated endlessly. Nicknames, songs, and gossip perpetuated punishment long after courts had finished. In this way, ordinary neighbors became enforcers of discipline. The power of the collective lay not in swords, but in tongues. Every whispered retelling carried governance forward without cost to the state. Sometimes humiliation even replaced execution. In Italy, rebels were paraded in cages instead of killed, their suffering prolonged in sight and laughter. Authorities calculated that living disgrace discouraged rebellion more effectively than martyrdom. The living fool was a better warning than the dead hero. At times, however, this weapon backfired. Excessive shaming provoked riots or sympathy for the disgraced. Chroniclers tell of crowds who turned against officials when punishments were perceived as too cruel. A careful balance had to be struck. Enough humiliation to correct, but not so much as to destabilize. Governing through shame required constant calibration. Thus, shame was not a side effect of medieval justice. It was its cornerstone. To govern was to orchestrate disgrace, to make punishment visible, repeatable, and memorable. Kings laughed at rebels, priests, exposed sinners, guilds, unmasked cheats, neighbors, mocked misfits. Altogether, they built a culture where humiliation was the glue of order. As we close this part, consider the psychological cost of living in such a world. If every misstep might be paraded, sung, or carved into memory, how would you carry yourself? Would fear make you obedient or simply weary? In the next part, we will examine the toll of constant shame on medieval identity, resilience, and mental life, and ask how echoes of this culture still ripple through our own societies today. As we reach the end of this journey through the medieval world of shame, let us gather the threads slowly and clearly. We have walked past pillories and stocks, ducking stools and cucking chairs. We have watched carts roll through market squares, heard kettles and pans clash in rough music, and listened to proverbs that carried a punishment long after the instrument was put away. We have met brewers and butchers, clerks and cobblers, widows and wanderers, children with bright eyes and cruel rhymes, priests with candles and lords with long memories. All of these scenes point to one truth in the Middle Ages: the fear of disgrace overshadowed the fear of pain. Pain faded, disgrace endured, stripes on the back closed, nicknames opened again every morning. A flogging could be counted and finished. A public joke had no fixed end. That is why thieves sometimes begged for lashes instead of the pillory. Why merchants feared a sign hung round the neck more than a bruise. Why many women dreaded the ducking stool, not for the cold water, but for the laughter that followed. In them home, punishment was not complete until it had an audience, and once the audience joined the script, the punishment kept living in memory. We also saw how humiliation served as a kind of government. Kings weakened rebels by turning them into spectacles. Priests staged penance to cut down pride and to make sin visible in the body. Guilds protected reputation with parades and placards, sacrificing a member to defend the craft's good name. Neighbors enforced order with charivari gossip and songs. Humiliation was cheap, vivid, and repeatable. It turned law into theater, and theater into habit. To live under such a system was to measure every step against the risk of becoming a story. Yet the past is not only cruelty. Throughout these pages, small, stubborn lights kept burning. A widow gave extra bread after a shaming to rebuild trust. A craftsman who accepted lashes instead of the pillory returned to work with eyes up and back straight. A child who was mocked left town began again elsewhere and raised a family who did not carry the old rhyme. Resilience did not end the system, but it made life within it bearable. Even where the crowd tried to fix a person in a single identity, some found ways to loosen the knot. If this history feels close to the present, that is because the stage has changed, not the script. We no longer gather at Cheapside or by the parish door, but we gather on screens. A photo or a clip can make a stranger familiar enough to mock. A nickname can become a hashtag. A rumor can sprint the length of a continent before breakfast. None of this is medieval, and yet all of it is. The same forces are at work: visibility, repetition, and the power of the crowd to turn an error into a spectacle. The old devices were wood and iron. The new ones are feeds and notifications. The result is similar pain is private, but shame is public and often permanent. What then should we carry forward from the past? First, a more precise empathy. When we see someone under a storm of mockery, we can remember that humiliation wounds identity more deeply than bruises. The bruise fades, the story stays. Second, a stricter discipline of our own attention. The medieval crowd gave power by gathering and laughing. We can choose not to amplify. We can watch less eagerly. We can let some small scandals die in silence. In a world where attention is fuel withholding, it is an act of care. Third, a gentler habit of speech. Medieval towns taught children with rhymes. We do the same with the words we repeat. A joke we pass along may become the nickname someone cannot shake. When we choose a kinder sentence, we do a small repair on the fabric of another person's life. It is not grand, but it is real. Before we part, let me invite you into the conversation. If you are listening where you can leave a comment, tell me about a moment when public embarrassment, yours or someone else's, changed how you move through the world. Did it make you more cautious, more compassionate, or more stubborn? Your story will help us understand how shame works now, just as chronicles and court rolls help us understand how it worked then. And one more gentle request. Where are you listening from? And which part of this series stayed with you the longest? Was it the theater of the pillory? The laughter of the crowd? The way reputation clung to families? The sermons that turned humiliation into medicine, the ballads that kept disgrace alive, or the stubborn flashes of human dignity in the middle of it all? I would love to know which thread tugged at you. As we step away from markets and bridges and church doors, the outline of a rule appears. Pain is bounded, disgrace is not. Pain is administered, disgrace is rehearsed. Pain belongs mainly to the body. Disgrace belongs to the body, the name and the story. That is why the medieval world feared shame so keenly, and that is why we should think carefully before we trade in it. People are more than their worst day. A community healthy in spirit knows how to correct without crushing, how to remember without deforming, and how to let a person become larger than a single scene. Thank you for walking this path with me. History is heavy, but it also clarifies. When we learn how others managed fear, punishment, and reputation, we gain language for our own dilemmas. We learn where to stand, when to speak, and when to be quiet. We learn how to be the kind of crowd that refuses to wound. If these chapters helped you see the past more clearly and the present more kindly, then the work has been worth it. This was a tour of why being shamed in the Middle Ages was worse than you might expect. The pillory has been taken down, but the impulse to display and to laugh remains sometimes in us. Let us be careful with it. May your days be free of needless disgrace and full of steady dignity. And may we meet again ready to listen harder and to judge more slowly wherever the next story takes us.